Hi YouTube, today's video is brought to you by EBC. Hi YouTube, today's video has been brought to you by EBC Brakes, who have very kindly sent me out a new set of pads and rotors for my 1989 Eunos Roadster. I'm back at Eurotech Autohouse where I'll be installing this, thanks to the guys for letting me use one of their lifts again, especially considering how busy the shop is today. EBC has very kindly sent me out two sets of pads, Ultimax and Yellow Stuff. This car will never be seeing any track time. It'll be used for twisty roads and going for spirited drives. It's a pretty slow car, but it's a lot of fun to drive, and I know a few other people will be interested in just driving their cars on the road, so hopefully this kind of review will be useful to you. Hi YouTube. So I've had the EBC pads and rotors on this car for about 1,000 kilometers now. They're well and truly bedded in, so it's time to do a bit of a review on what they're like to drive. Today's video is completely off the cuff. The reason it's off the cuff is because I've gotten out in a hurry while it's wet and cold, which it normally isn't in my part of the world. However, if you're buying EBC products, there's a very high probability that it is wetter and colder where you live. So I'm taking the opportunity now to get out here and talk about what it's like to have these rotors on the car, the pads and rotors on the car. Now, before we get started, I do want to talk about a couple of negatives with EBC. They're mostly to do with marketing. EBC is a well-known company. The quality of the products is as you'd expect from a company of their side. They're very high quality and they seem to have good customer relations as well. At least when I've dealt with them, I've been quite happy with the way things have gone. But onto the negatives. I'm not a big fan of marketing BS that you see in a lot of the aftermarket automotive world, and I do have to say that the EBC website is both a bit clunky and full of a bit of nonsense in terms of just kind of saying, yes, if you get this pad it provides more grip or a great bite, and that doesn't really help you. Whereas if you look at one of their competitors, which is Hawk Performance, they are definitely a go-to pad for the MX-5 crowd in Australia, and I'm given that impression over in the US as well, and for good reason. If you jump on their website, you can see the performance curves of their pads, so even if you're not getting academic, you have an understanding of what you're purchasing if you want to try and get more overall grip or a larger temperature range, depending on your usage scenario. With EBC, you can't do that. You just have to go and read the page and be like, alright, well, I guess this is the right pad. Now, that doesn't detract from the quality of the pads, as you'll soon find out when I talk about what they're like to drive, but I can't give you anything quantifiable about how this pad performs, or the Yellow Stuff pads when I get to them, because I'm not provided that information either. So that's a criticism on marketing, and probably a better way to approach it, especially if they're targeting enthusiasts who want enthusiast information like that. So make of that what you will. Another criticism I had, which is a very minor one, is that there was no anti-squeal grease with the pads.
Squeal. Whee! Squeal. Squeal louder. Louder.
I find that if you're selling aftermarket pads, especially for enthusiast cars like MX-5s, where it's very likely that this is the very first car that someone's ever going to work on themselves, little details like that make the whole experience a bit more enjoyable and a bit more comfortable. I've used other pads in the past, and quite a lot of them do come with anti-squeal grease. So those are the negatives that I had to get out of the way. So I just wanted to share an observation that I made after filming the segment in the car. You can see that this rim is actually quite dusty. Now, that's only from about 500 kilometers worth of driving, and it is definitely from the pads and not the black protective coating that was on the rims when they were new. I've actually washed the car since wearing that coating off, so this is only brake dust. These are probably the dustiest OEM style pads that I've used, you do get a lot more dust from racing pads, and you do tend to get more dust when you have slotted rotors, as it wears the surface down a bit quicker. But normally I only see dust build up like this on cars with brake ducts, because all the air blowing through will cause the dust to settle on the rim. This doesn't have brake ducts, so these are just very dusty pads. This is neither a good thing or a bad thing, just an observation if it's the sort of thing that matters to you. It doesn't bother me particularly, I'll just put a coating on there to help stop the brake dust settling, but something to keep in mind if it bothers you. Now, before I take off, I just want to give a bit of context on how this car is getting driven. I have other cars that are more suitable for the track than this one. This is a very original 1989 Eunos Roadster, and that's how it's going to stay, because to me this car is a novelty that I like to drive normally, and it's only ever going to see normal conditions and maybe a skid pan, which is a scenario where it's never going to get hot enough for the brakes to really cause any issues, which fed into why I decided not to upgrade these to the later brakes, which are larger. Well, that was a lot easier than I thought it would be. They're like toys. And I will get to that when I demonstrate how the braking works in the wet. So I think it's time to take off, and I will start talking about what this car is like to drive when it's dry. Now, the Ultimax pads are marketed as an OEM style replacement pad, and at that, bang on. They're exactly what you would expect for something that is meant to be an OEM replacement style pad. They have fantastic feel, better than some of the other OEM style brands that I've driven, which I've weirdly noticed a sort of softness, which can be really strange considering it's coming from a pad. You'd always expect the pads to be quite a stiff material, but you can feel a softness in some brake pads, which I don't get from these. So you've got a great sense of feel of how deep you're pressing and how hard you're pressing your pads into the rotor, which makes it really easy to bring the car down to a stop in a normal, healthy fashion when you're on the road. And when you're driving them on the road at normal road speeds, 60, 80 kilometers an hour and so on, they provide an excellent amount of stopping force with a normal amount of force in your braking foot, which is exactly what you would expect, and you're not really at risk of locking up the car until you're sort of below 60 kilometers an hour, probably closer to 40 when it's dry. And even when they do lock up, you actually have a really good ability to modulate these pads. They're not so sticky that as soon as you lift off and come back on, they're locking up again. You can actually lift off and get back onto the brakes in a reasonable fashion to bring back your braking capacity, which is really good. And that feeds into why I didn't want to upgrade the pads, didn't want to upgrade the rotors, because as you start to apply more force, you lose the resolution with how you can apply your brakes. So I'll show you what I mean in the wet, and this is where it's really important, is that driving at a nice normal speed, get up to 60 kilometers an hour, it's wet, and it's really easy to lock up the brakes, but also really easy to get off them and then bring your stopping distance back to something sensible. If you go to larger calipers and larger rotors or grippier pads, you're going to start losing that resolution. So if you're using your car on the road, that may not be the best choice for you. Those bigger calipers are much better suited to cars with ABS, where they can compensate for your inability to compensate. And that's not an attack on driver skill, that's just what happens if you're in a panic scenario where you need to hit the brakes quickly. Your foot's just going to get buried into the floor, and you're not even going to think about trying to modulate to come to a stop. And that's why ABS is so unilateral now, is because it's better than you are whether or not you think you can do it. And that's really important. Whereas having a little less braking force means that I can get away with applying a bit more force and have a bit more control before I'm at risk of sliding into the car in front in an emergency stop. And that was a big part of why I've decided to keep the tiny little rotors that this car had originally with the tiny little brake pads, because on the road they're good enough. And as you could see, at 60 kilometers an hour in the wet, I can easily achieve full lock on this vehicle, but I can also back off it and bring the car back to a sensible stop. In the dry, the size of the calipers and the brake force applied with the grip on those pads is perfect. As you'd expect for OEM, it is safe. But even in the wet, it is also safe. And that's what's important when I'm driving a car on the road. Now on the track, completely different scenario. You may never get below 80 kilometers an hour, so you may not be interested in having a concern about your brakes locking up in speeds like 60 kilometers an hour or 40 kilometers an hour. It just may not be something that worries you. But for me, the way that this car is going to be used, I want to be able to drive at a normal road speed and easily bring the car to a dead stop without locking it up in the wet, which I just did. But if I do lock it up, I want to be able to bring the braking feel back with a little bit of modulation, which I can actually do on this car. So just demonstrating that again, getting up to a nice sensible road speed. Someone's just pulled out in front of me, I panic, but I can get back on the brakes and bring the car to a stop sensibly. And you will lose that with really aggressive pads or larger rotors. So that's why we're out here in the wet, taking advantage of the opportunity to show you that. So if you are in a wetter or colder part of the world, that's a really important thing to keep in mind. Something else to keep in mind is whether or not you decide to run slotted rotors. Now, contrary to popular belief, slotted and cross-drilled rotors do not run cooler than plain face rotors. They run hotter. And the reason for that is that the heat is transferred in braking over the pad face into the surface of the rotor, and the larger that surface, the more heat transfers across effectively. So when you have slots and cross drills, less heat can transfer as easily, so you actually get hot spots on your rotor, which is a big contributor for why cross-drilled rotors will get cracks around the holes. They get much hotter around those cross drills, and thermal expansion and gets at a different rate, so it can crack. Now if you're going off-road, they can be very useful though, because they allow dirt and water, if you're really seriously off-roading, to get through the rotor and out of the way of the pad. On a track, the risk of cracking is too high for them to be safe. People talk about using slotted rotors for getting rid of gases and stuff that build up on your pad, but that's much less of an issue today than it was in the 70s, because the way that pads are made, they don't gas up as much. But it does make a much bigger difference on days like today, where there's a lot of crap and oil and water being kicked up onto the rotor. It allows the pad to clean the surface of the rotor as you're braking and substantially improve your braking feel. So again, I do have to say that the EBC rotors are very good for that. They do have a fantastic feel to them in that scenario. This isn't necessarily something that's easily quantified, though I do have a video coming up where I've been brake testing pad and rotor combinations on 2 cars that are both running the same tyres to try and demonstrate that. So if you're interested in that sort of thing, subscribe and you'll be seeing that coming up later. But so you can measure it, but it's difficult. But it is definitely something you can feel. You can definitely get a feel for when you're running slotted rotors compared to plain rotors, especially if you change them back to back. You will notice that difference, which I have done and I have coming up later. But yes, very happy with the way that EBC's rotors have performed in that scenario. So overall, very happy with the Ultimax pads. I'll be really interested to see how the yellow stuff pads go, because EBC markets them as having much higher levels of grip and bite, and the way the car is driving right now, I don't know if that's going to be a good thing. The pads themselves might be good and they might be really well suited to cars with ABS or cars that are doing a lot of skid pans and being driven more aggressively, but it'll be interesting to see what they're like on this vehicle. For now, I'm really happy with how EBC's gone, so if you do want to see how I go with the yellow stuff pads, please subscribe, like the video, or don't like the video, doesn't really matter, but if you subscribe I can do more of these videos because I can give you more stuff. So hopefully that was useful to you. Sorry if it was a bit rambly, it's all been done off the cuff for you today, and hopefully I'll see you again. Today's video is all about the EBC rotors and pads and reviewing them and why I decided not to upgrade. But I thought I would just show you a couple of other interesting car nerd things while I'm here. So the odometer shows 105,371 kilometers, which is very low from a 1989 car. Now, it can always be a bit difficult to believe things like that on MX-5s because very rarely do they come with books, and this one being an import as well, you never know if it was fiddled with before it got here. However, when you look at the condition of the interior, it is very good. We've got a nice crack-free dash, and I'll show a couple of other interesting little details. So if we come into the engine bay, we've still got original Japanese stickers on the bonnet here. Those things don't tend to last on cars that have been doing a lot of mileage. We've still got some Japanese stickers right up on the front here. And if we get under the car, some of the extra work that I've been doing has been replacing the control arms because the boots were deteriorated, replaced the deteriorated suspension, which was the original suspension, the tie rod ends, and the same thing around the rear of the car. Now if I go to those used parts, some interesting things to notice. So this is one of the boots from the suspension, and it's brittle. So the bump stops had completely deteriorated, but the suspension itself was in good nick. So that was just the sort of thing you'd expect from a car that has low mileage but is old. All the rubber parts deteriorate, but all the mechanical joints, like this ball joint, which you can see is split. But if we get right in there, you can see the grease is clean, and there's absolutely no play in that. So that's the same thing with the tie rod ends here. Split, but clean. No movement in those. And if I come around over to the original brake rotors, these tiny little toys here, the rust built up on these, I actually think these are the original rotors from 1989. You can see some cracks in the rotors, and this rotor in particular is in very poor condition, so I'm expecting a very substantial improvement thanks to EBC. But the condition of the rubber compared to the condition of the mechanical joints, I think the mileage on this car is very genuine, which is pretty cool. So, you know, I could probably go and dig up the import certificate and confirm it. But there was one other thing in the engine bay. There's a service sticker here. Here it is. So that's from 2013, and it had 89,970 kilometers on it then. So it's believable. I think someone bought this in as a low mileage collector car, and its books have since been lost, but I think the mileage is real. Very cool. And another little interesting thing, when I was trying to get the rear calipers on, this one here is seized, so I've got a rebuild kit on its way, so I'm doing that at the moment as well. But you can see there's a very stark difference between these two calipers, and it's not uncommon for cars that do low mileage to have calipers seized from just sitting in the same position for a long time. I think that this caliper is replaced some time ago, and that this one has since seized, having only done about 15,000 kilometers since 2013. I think that this one has seized and is the original caliper. So again, I'm pretty convinced that this car is all original mileage.